Welcome back to Required Reading. I'm Russ, and today we continue our read of Ghostbusters The Return. This is Chapter 16. Venkman laid the index cards with his notes on top of his podium and looked around the studio, trying to get his mind to stop racing. What with the impending debate, attacking sea serpents, and everything else that was going on right now, his thoughts were a blur at the moment. A little focus would have been welcome. He looked out at the audience that sat in collapsible metal bleachers behind the row of television cameras. He searched the crowd for Dana, or any other friendly faces, but with the studio darkened and the bright light shining in his eyes, he couldn't see any of the audience members well enough to recognize them. In fact, he didn't even recognize most of the candidates who shared the stage with him, although he could see them just fine. Each was standing at a separate identical podium spaced evenly across the stage. Of course, he did recognize the mayor, who was standing behind the podium at the opposite end of the stage. Lipinski caught Venkman's eye and glared at him. Venkman blew him a kiss in return. In Venkman's opinion, and to be fair, many observers' opinions as well, the presence of the other four candidates was more than a little pointless. Everyone knew that the race was really down to the two leading contenders, Venkman and Lipinski. However, equal time legislation meant that the televised debate had to include all six of the candidates who were officially on the ballot, whether they had any real chance at winning the election or not. The moderator sat behind a desk, facing them from the front of the stage. She was Ginny Gwynn, anchor for the news station's local newscast and New York's correspondent for the national coverage. In the space of just a few short years, she had already racked up a shelf full of journalism awards and built herself a reputation as a serious reporter who pulled no punches, whether she was dealing with gangsters or the governor. Not that Venkman recognized her from newscasts. He didn't really watch the news, since he generally found current events too dull to bother with. But it was hard to miss her print ads, which was plastered on buses and billboards all over the city. Even if the sheer exposure hadn't been enough to make her stick in his memory, there was also the fact, in his humble opinion, she was a babe. At that moment, Gwen was leaning back in her chair with her feet on the desk as she paged through her own notes. A large clock was mounted on the front of her desk. It stared out at the candidates to make it easier for them to stay within their appointed time limits. 5 seconds, said the stage manager. Venkman cleared his throat and straightened his tie. Gwen showed no signs of moving from her comfortable position. He wondered if she heard. 4. Gwen still hadn't moved. 3. 2. The movement was so smooth and practiced that if Venkman hadn't already been watching, he would have missed the whole thing. As the stage manager said 2, Gwen slid her feet off the desk, sat up in the chair, laid her papers and hands on the desk, and looked cool and professional just as the red light on the television camera lit up. "Hello and welcome," she said. "I'm Ginny Gwynn, and this is the New York City mayoral debate. With only a little more than 4 weeks to go before the municipal election, we've brought the candidates together to discuss their platforms and address the issues." The cameras flashed on briefly for a close-up of each candidate as Gwen recited each name in turn. With us in the studio today are His Honor Incumbent Mayor Arnold Lipinski, Republican Party. The mayor nodded to the camera with a wink and a confident smile. Democratic Party candidate David Sumner. "That's Summer," said the candidate. "Oh, excuse me. Summer," said Gwen quickly. She moved on. "Green Party candidate Dylan Karma Gonzalez." The candidate in the ponytail raised 2 fingers in a peace sign. "Chartreuse Party candidate Libby Kay." "Hello," said an impeccably coordinated woman in a matching suit, shoes, lipstick, and eyeshadow. "Right to Smoke Party candidate Wallace Schlunk." "How you doing?" said a shaky, sallow-faced man, taking a drag on an unlit cigarette. "And New York State Independent Party candidate Peter Venkman." Venkman looked deeply into the camera lens with the most sincere expression he could manage. Hi. There were whoops from the audience, or to be precise, what sounded like a couple of voices in the audience. Through the glare, Venkman thought he saw a couple of silhouetted arms waving in the bleachers. Or maybe they were flags? Is that Lewis? He thought. And Dana? Each candidate will be given 2 minutes to deliver an opening statement, said Gwyn. Subsequently, I will ask the candidates a series of 5 questions. Each candidate will have 1 minute to offer a response, followed by 30 seconds for a rebuttal. Finally, each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. Venkman barely heard Gwyn as she laid out the rules for the audience. Despite his best efforts at focusing his thoughts, his mind was still racing. Nervousness over the debate would have been bad enough by itself, with the facts and figures smashing up against each other in his head, but the knowledge that his friends were out there, fighting for their lives against giant reptilian monsters, made it even harder to stay centered. Somehow, the danger of looking foolish or exceeding the time limit just didn't seem all that serious when he weighed it against the possibility of being chewed up and swallowed alive. The order of the speakers has been determined by a random drawing, said Gwyn. The first opening statement will come from Mr. Schlunk. Thank you, said Schlunk. He was then seized by a coughing fit that consumed the first 15 seconds of 2 minutes. Venkman screamed at himself silently. Hey, he thought, get it together. It was one thing to space out during the rules. After all, he'd been briefed on them until he could recite them backwards and forwards, but not paying attention when his opponents were speaking was just plain stupid. He needed to stay sharp to catch their openings and weak spots, and to defend himself against anything that was thrown his way. He took a deep breath, then turned to face Schlunk and catch the rest of his statement. Fascist oppression of our precious personal freedoms, Schlunk said between wheezing breaths. Thank you, said Gwyn. Miss Kay, may we have your opening statement? Certainly. Kay looked into the camera with a prim smile. Over the past few years, we've heard a great deal from the present administration about addressing the issue of quality of life crimes. Yet one of the most serious crimes against our quality of life continues unabated and unenforced. As a certain color life consultant, it is obvious to me that at its heart, New York is a spring city. However, rampant mismanagement and miscoloring has left it dressed in colors that say winter, or autumn at best. Immediate action must be taken. We must begin an extensive program of renovation and repainting to better align the aura of the city with... Venkman found himself starting to drift again. He pulled himself back with a sharp mental yank. Enough already, he scolded himself. This one's for all the marbles. If you could believe the latest polls, he had a serious shot at the mayor's office right now. And once he was planted behind the desk, the sky was the limit. Easy Street was just around the corner. But if he wanted to get there, he was going to have to ace this debate. As Milken explained, there probably weren't going to be all that many people following the debate in real time on TV or radio. Afterwards, though, the results would be carried by every newspaper and every news program in the metropolitan area, and every account would lead off by saying who won. The debate was big. He couldn't afford to blow it. He forced his attention back to everything that was proceeding around him. Kay was saying something about the more positive color scheme instilling a sense of pride in the city and discouraging crime. He hoped the other Ghostbusters were all right. Oh, he was rational enough to know that whether he was there fighting beside them or not, the outcome was probably going to be the same. The threat was too big for one person to swing one way or another. Either they were going to figure out a way to stop it, and everyone would go home happy, or they weren't, and no one in New York City would go home happy again. but he still felt as though he should be there. Yet he also knew that he had to be here. Was it any wonder that he was having so much trouble focusing? "Thank you, Miss K, for a colorful statement," said Gwyn. The audience chuckled. Venkman heard Golden's voice through his earpiece. "Nothing to worry about so far, but those are the lightweights, Peter. You're scheduled to be up next. Get ready." Venkman cleared his throat and shook the mental cobwebs out of his head. Showtime, he thought. "Next we'll hear from Peter Venkman," said Gwyn. "Dr. Venkman, your statement." Venkman nodded to the cameras. "Thank you," he said. "I look on New York." Everyone watched him expectantly, waiting for the rest of his sentence. But nothing more seemed to be coming. He just stared at the camera and remained silent. The seconds were ticking by. Golden's voice sounded desperate through the earpiece. "Oh, jeez, he's frozen." With forced calm, he said, "Peter, it's okay. You're okay. Just say the words with me. I look on New York as a city filled with potential." Venkman didn't say anything. "Dr. Venkman," said Gwyn. Finally, he relaxed his shoulders and spoke. "Look, I'm sorry," he said to the camera. "I really want to be mayor. Really." Golden's electronically filtered voice screamed in his ear. "Peter, what are you doing? Don't start ad-libbing. Stick with the statement we rehearsed." Venkman removed the earpiece from his ear. "But here's the thing," he continued. "Right now, some friends of mine are risking their lives to try and stop a bunch of big, ugly, giant lizards from destroying New York. Oh, don't get me wrong. They're good at this kind of thing. They're the best. But there's no way they can do this alone. Now, I don't know if I can make any difference against these things. It's not like I'm John Wayne or anything. Maybe we'll all just end up as one big blue plate special of Monster Chow. But I've got to try." He loosened his tie and gestured towards the other candidates. "All of these people up here have plenty to say about the city and the issues and what they want to do. It's important stuff, and you should listen to what they have to say. But I can't be a part of it right now. I've got to go. Maybe this will cost me the election. Maybe not. I don't know. But in the vast scheme of things, it really doesn't matter because, some things in life, like friendship or saving lives, well, they're more important than politics." He started to step away from the podium, then stopped himself and looked up into the audience. "Oh, and Dana?" he said. "I love you." With that, he ran out of the studio. For nearly a full minute, the studio was silent. Everyone, the audience, the candidates, the moderator, the television crew, stared slack-jawed at the door that was slowly swinging closed. Over the control booth, the director told the crew to switch to the camera that was focused on Gwyn. It took her a few seconds to realize that the red light on the camera was on. Well, yes," Gwyn said, shuffling through her notes as she tried to get the situation back on track. Thank you, Dr. Venkman." The crowd stirred behind her as roughly half of the news reporters rushed out to follow the story that was breaking elsewhere. The ones who stayed behind were all whispering into cell phones, creating an undercurrent of hushed noise that even the candidates could hear. "Our next statement will come from incumbent Mayor Arnold Lipinski," said Gwyn. "Mr. Mayor?" Lipinski looked as though someone had just punched him in the stomach. Slowly, he turned to the camera and smiled weakly. Okay. Right. Thank you, Jenny. In my many years of service to this great city..." "All right, I think I have the answer now," said Egon. "After careful consideration, weighing all of the possible scenarios and coupled with the relevant environmental and topographical factors, one plan of action emerges clearly." "Yeah? What's that?" "We're all going to die." At that moment, it seemed difficult to argue the point. Ray, Egon, and Winston were holed up behind the 79th Street overpass that separated Riverside Park from the West Side Highway and the river beyond. It was far enough away from the riverbank to be nearly outside the creature's reach. Actually, the largest one could stretch its neck a little beyond the overpass. However, its neck wasn't flexible enough to let it twist around to reach them. Not as long as they stayed plastered to the far side of the overpass. If they tried to step away, though, they'd be fair game. Fortunately, by this point, they didn't have a lot of bystanders to worry about. The police had cordoned off the highway and the streets immediately adjacent to the southern end of the park. There were plenty of emergency personnel, reporters, and rubberneckers just beyond the police line, but the park was essentially clear. Unless the creatures turned out to be amphibious and started walking out of the water, which wasn't something that anybody wanted to think about right now, the civilians should be safe. So that just left themselves to worry about. "Hi guys, nice to see ya. How you been?" They looked up to see Venkman throwing himself against the overpass beside them. Like Winston, he was wearing a proton pack over his expensive suit and overcoat. "Fine, thanks. And you?" said Ray. "Oh, you know, can't complain." "Shouldn't you be on television right now?" asked Winston. Venkman gestured up towards the camera at the police line. "I think I am, actually. Smile." "I meant the debate." "Oh, yeah, that. I blew it off. I was getting dull." A flurry of thoughts flashed through Winston's brain. He thought about the time and effort they'd put into the campaign. He thought about what Venkman's absence during the debate might cost them. Most of all, he was thinking about how disappointed his mama would be. Then he thought about what she would tell him to do. He shrugged. "I guess I would have done the same thing. In fact, if I recall correctly, you did do the same thing," said Venkman. Egon pointed at Venkman's proton pack. "And you stopped off to pick up your equipment along the way?" "You know, you guys shouldn't leave the ectomobile on lock like that," said Venkman. "I mean, this is New York after all. Just anybody could come along and walk off with the stuff." "So I keep hearing," said Egon. "By the way," Venkman added, "love what you've done with the car. The concrete's a nice touch. Very downtown exposed brick bohemian." With a deafening roar, one of the monsters slammed into the top of the overpass. Venkman looked at Ray. "What are you grinning about?" "Nice to have you back," Ray replied. Venkman returned the grin. "So, what's the deal with the geckos?" "They're obviously some sort of full corporeal ectoplasmic manifestation," said Egon. "Judging from the water displacement, these aren't insubstantial phantoms or wraiths. They're solid. And from the way they keep screaming about Xanthador, it's pretty clear where they came from," Ray added. "But what to do about them? That one's stickier." "The cops tried bullets," said Winston. "Guess what? It didn't do a whole lot." "I'm shocked," said Venkman. "Yeah, but Ray and Egon didn't have much luck with Neutrino ones either," said Winston. "The things are just too powerful." "So how do we get rid of them?" "Good question," said Egon. "Technically, Nessie and her family shouldn't even exist." "Giant sea serpents in the Hudson River?" Venkman shrugged. "Gotta tell you, it wouldn't surprise me. You know, what's in the water." "Besides that," said Ray, "manifesting solid creatures takes big power. We're talking Gozer-level power. Xanthador shouldn't be that strong. Not yet, anyway." "Xanthador's strength has been growing as he feeds off people's fears. That's why the severity of the incidents has been increasing steadily," said Egon. "But even so, according to the prophecy, he should be a good century away from the kind of power levels it would take to manifest something on this scale." Approximately 1 block uptown, one of the smaller creatures whipped its head through a cluster of trees. The Ghostbusters pressed their bodies back against the overpass as one of the trees was hurtling past. "Prophecy? What prophecy?" asked Winston. Ray reached into his pocket and produced his photocopy of the parchment. He unfolded it and passed the paper to Venkman and Winston. "Here, see? Xanthador's not supposed to hit these kinds of power levels until Saturn aligns with Venus and Mars. And that's not going to happen for another 175 years. Venkman studied the drawing with a curious expression. "What's up?" asked Winston. "I don't know. It just looks familiar." "From your extensive studies of astronomy or a tic-tac-toe board?" Egon said dryly. No, really, I can't place it. Suddenly, Venkman's eyes lit up. Wait a minute. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and drew out some papers. He shuffled through them for a moment to find the one he was looking for. When's the soonest that the planets are supposed to line up that way? 170 years from now, Egon replied. Give or take, Ray added. Nope, said Venkman. Nope, asked Winston. Nope. I can show you a place where it happens 5 times a day. Huh? Said Ray. Venkman held up Ray's photocopy to display the drawing. Beside it, he held up a brochure with an illustration that showed the 3 planets in the same position as in the drawing. Of course, said Winston. The Star Show, said Ray. Venkman nodded. At the Hayden Planetarium. Judging from his expression, the reporter was saying something very earnest and intense, but Janine couldn't hear what it was. She had long since turned off the sound on the television in the Ghostbusters headquarters. There were only so many times she needed to hear about how vast the danger was and how her heroic, noble friends and employers were facing certain death. Instead, she left the picture on while she continued to pore over the various reference materials, searching for some scrap of information that might help turn the tide. From time to time, she glanced over to see the images of the rampaging serpents, or, more often, endless series of talking heads as the self-proclaimed experts speculated about the danger, possible strategies, and what might happen next. Maybe it was the stress that came with her concern over the Ghostbusters' safety, or maybe she had spent so many days with ancient texts that she simply was burned out. One way or another, Janine felt as though she couldn't bring herself to face another crumbling, yellowed page. So she decided to play a hunch instead. She turned to her computer. She was clicking her way through the website of the New England Genealogical Society when she found what she was looking for. Oh my, she muttered. So Xanthodor's power is coming from the Hayden Planetarium? Said Winston. Not exactly, Egon replied. Xanthodor's power comes from fear, but the planetarium show sets the stage for his ascendance by satisfying the conditions of the prophecy. Attached to the Museum of Natural History, the Hayden Planetarium had long served as an introduction to astronomy for countless children and adults from the New York area. One of the most popular features of the planetarium was its star shows, in which images of constellations and heavenly bodies were projected over the heads of the audience against the 360-degree backdrop of an immense dome ceiling. So, if we can stop the show, we should be able to disrupt Xanthodor's power, said Ray. Theoretically. Even if it fails to disperse his current level of power, it could prevent him from growing any more powerful, said Egon. Yet there's also the possibility that it might accomplish nothing other than proving the prophecy wrong. Unless anybody's got any better ideas, I'd say it's worth a shot, said Winston. That's great, guys, really, said Venkman, throwing back a thumb to point over his shoulder. But don't you think we ought to do something about these things first? As if to emphasize his point, the ground shook as one of the gargantuan serpents lunged forward to strike the far side of the overpass once again. If our hypothesis proves to be correct, once we disrupt the star show, these creatures should vanish, said Egon. But Peter's right, said Ray. We can't just let these things run around loose while we head off to the planetarium. What do you suggest? Said Egon. It would take simultaneous ion streams from all 4 of us just to bind one of the creatures. While we're all busy restraining one creature, we'd be sitting ducks to be devoured by the other 2. Besides, even if we could avoid being eaten alive, what would we do once we have them? They're solid, remember? Ectotraps won't work, and we have no way to contain them. We can't just stand there holding them forever. That's right, said Winston. They're solid. A little too solid, said Ray. These things aren't any smaller than alligators, are they? Said Winston. One of the creatures slammed its head into the overpass once again. I'm not seeing any candidates for Mensa here, said Venkman. Then I've got an idea, said Winston. Slipping his Neutrona wand out of its sheath, Winston walked out into the roadway. From where he stood, he could see all three of the creatures through the short tunnel beneath the overpass. Winston, as your running mate, I'd have to say this is a very bad idea. Venkman turned to Egon. Does he know what he's doing? Doubtful, said Egon. I hope you have a backup candidate lined up for that deputy mayor slot, Peter, said Winston. I could, Venkman said with a hint of sarcasm, but Ray's always been a little soft on the whole crime issue thing. Winston, shouted Egon, come back. Nah, said Winston, trying to appear calm despite the cold sweat that was already coating his face and hands. No problem. I've got it covered. The Rays' voices seemed to catch the attention of the closest creature. Winston said a quick, silent prayer and took advantage of the opening. He raised his Neutrona wand and fired short bursts at the other two serpents. Hey, over here, he yelled. Puny mortal, hissed the nearest one. Flee in abject horror before the minions of Zandador. Flee? From you three? Winston shouted back, incredulous. Yeah, right. I'm gonna kick your sorry Scottish haggis all the way back to Bagpipe Land. Behind him, he could hear Ray say, he did hear us when we said traps don't work on these things, right? I sure hope so, Venkman replied. Winston had the attention of all three monsters now. They eyed him curiously as more distant ones sailed closer through the water. None of the beasts were attacking yet, but there was no mistaking the air of impending doom that surrounded them. Yeah, that's right. I'm talking to you. You know, I thought I'd seen some ugly mess coming out of that river, but that's like roses compared to you freaks. He punctuated his speech by striking the creatures with more short bursts from his Neutrona wand, alternating among them. The burst made the monsters wince, but the only real effect seemed to be making them even angrier. He's lost his mind, said Egon. By this point, all three serpents were clustered together around the far side of the overpass. Growling, their heads bobbed back and forth as each of them sized up the proper instant to swallow their minuscule prey. Winston looked back at them through the opening in the overpass, dwarfed by their sheer scale. It occurred to him that just the visible parts of the creatures were as tall as the apartment buildings in his neighborhood. Maybe this wasn't such a great idea after all. No time to worry about that. Gotta stay focused, he told himself, pushing the thought out of his mind. Man, Xanthador must be really scraping the bottom of the lock with you three, he shouted. I wouldn't bother to scrape you off the bottom of my shoe. He peppered the three beasts with extended series of short ion blasts. They roared, more out of rage than pain. Then as one, they all lunged at Winston, with jaws gaping wide. It was that moment he had been waiting for. He leaped aside, out of the roadway, and kept running, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the creatures as they thrust their heads through the opening beneath the overpass. Seeing that they had missed, the serpents tried to rear back for another strike. But as they pulled back, their heads jammed together and wedged against the ceiling of the tunnel. The creatures looked startled as over and over they slid their heads back and forth, trying to free them, but it was no use. Alone, any one of them could have slipped out of the space without much effort. With all three of them jammed together, though, there was simply not enough room to maneuver. The reinforced overpass held. All the trapped creatures could do was roar in helpless fury, which they did. A lot. Taking care to stay outside the serpent's considerably shortened reach, the Ghostbusters started to head out of the park. Not bad, Venkman told Winston, giving him a slap on the back. Just observing the leash laws, said Winston. Next stop, Hayden Planetarium, said Egon. And the main event, added Ray. Smile for your public, boys, said Venkman. As they reached the street beyond the park, the crowd burst into cheers and applause. Egon took a deep breath. Under his breath, he muttered, So much for the preliminaries. Now for the hard part. Hey, thanks for checking out that episode of Required Reading. If you'd like to support the show or just show everyone how cool you are, be sure to click on the link in the description down below to check out our merchandise store.